Welcome to Clariot Noir. The following recordings are based on real events in Bridal Veil Lake. Stories come directly from the people who have experienced them. Listener discretion is advised. Jewelry Box Music by Harrison Secord. Full disclosure, I've told this story countless times and even written down and published it about a decade ago. I keep looking for an answer to the strangest experience of my life. So far, I'm no closer to understanding what happened. 5 teenage boys, late one summer night, seemingly lured away into the dark. I was too young to remember when my family regularly started spending summers at Heaven Pentecostal Camp, located on the northwestern side of the Forest Gorge, kind of overlooking the gorge and the Black River. The camp curfew for everyone, regardless of age, was 11 p.m., late for kids and much later than when most parents expect their teenagers to be indoors. Evening church services were the cause. Sometimes they ran even past this curfew, if there was what is called an altar call. The pastor calls up anyone who wishes to pray at the front of the church. I'm still not exactly sure why, and probably will never know. I haven't been back to church in about 20 years. But these rituals produce lots of people speaking in tongues and being touched by the Spirit, which usually look like passing out and hitting the floor. I always wondered if anyone got hurt this way. In any case, my friends and I almost never stayed for altar calls, unless it was to repent something bad we thought we did. Instead, we roamed the night, playing pranks, throwing eggs at cottages, knocking on doors and running, that kind of stupid crap. By far, however, our favorite nefarious pastime was staying out past curfew and getting chased down by the camp's lone security guard, an older guy named Ralph. He would chase us all over on his 10-speed with his flashlight and zero hope of ever catching us. We knew the grounds too well and all the best hiding places. Most of these spots were close to the borders of the camp, with one even being across the road, outside and a little ways away from the main gate, overlooking the Black River. It was pitch dark there, and a great make-out and cigarette smoking spot. If something were to happen, something weird, you'd think it'd be there. But it wasn't the hiding spot we chose that night. That night, we went to the Stone Road, the last unpaved remnant of the camp, difficult for a 10-speed bike to traverse. There weren't many cottages at this point in time, and the rentals that used to be nearby had all been torn down a year or so prior. The lights had been neglected too, and if I'm recalling events correctly, there was only one there. Marking the border of the camp was a rusty wire fence. We gathered at the camp's edge and laughed at poor Ralph's futile efforts to catch us. That's about when the music started. Imagine your grandmother's jewelry box opening and the tinkling that follows. That's what we all heard, except without the jewelry box and louder. I was caught off guard by the sudden music. All of us were, I think, but we weren't scared. Not yet. Intrigued, we started walking along, following the wire fence, until we came to a part that appeared to have been smashed down, as if someone had passed outside the camp and into the rough country beyond. It was here we hesitated for a moment. I recall peering into the darkness, my eyes adjusting until I could make out the vague outline of a road, grown over with grass and small trees. The road ran into the wire fence, which could only mean, in addition to the plant life, it was no longer used and likely hadn't been for a long time. I'm not sure which of us suggested crossing the mashed fence to search for the source of the music. Within a very short distance, however, we were practically blind. The only source of light remained the poor orange web-covered thing behind us, so we moved forward along the road very slowly. I remember going over a small rise and then descending slightly. As the tinkling jewelry box music continued, our steps gave out entirely when we saw a wall of fog coming from the left. I've never seen anything like it before. It rolled over top of us, and I lost sight of my friends, who were only a few steps away. I was beginning to freak out a little, and so I felt in my back pocket for my knife, a tiny inch-long blade that ranked somewhere below letter opener and butter varieties. I clenched that little thing as if my life depended on it. The fog lingered, and I started to wonder what the hell I was going to do. But then it slowly began to settle, and my friends, as shadowy and hard to make out as they were revealed. Below our knees, the abandoned road was still hidden, I caught a glimpse of one of my friend's eyes. He saw the knife in my hand. I said, without thinking, "I'm ready." And he chuckled, which made me feel better. Sure, the jewelry box music was still playing, and we had just been enveloped by a sudden molesting fog, but both of these things weren't unexplainable. Fog rolled. People did all kinds of stupid stuff in the middle of the night, right? My relief vanished at the sight of my friend and then friends bending down to search the fog with their hands. It took until I saw one of them stand back up with a stick, test it against his hand, to understand completely what they were doing, arming themselves, just as I had. At this point in our mildly creepy adventure, we might have had the bright idea of returning to the camp and blurry orange light behind us. We might have, if one of us hadn't phrased this idea in the stupidest way possible. Who wants to go back? I don't know who said it. I can't remember, or maybe I never knew which of the friendly dumb shades around me asked the question to unmake forever our recently acquired cool reputations, if we should be the one who decided to go back. I'd just had the best summer of my life. I'd had girlfriends, been kissed, made out. I wanted to do these things, and the stuff I didn't just mention, again, and with the possibility of more teenage movie-like adventures. Standing there, knife in hand, damp from fog, beginning to shiver, still very aware of the jewelry box music accompanying the scene, I quickly envisioned becoming a ghost to the girls in the camp. I already was that guy at home. No teenage boy wants to be branded a coward. I imagine my friends thought the same, because nobody said a word. Eventually, it was like we had no choice but to go forward, to keep following the music, or trying to anyway. We stumbled over the foggy ground until we came to a wild line of pine trees. I was seriously beginning to lose my nerve at this point, and thought, surely we must now, as a team, turn back. This was a real forest in front of us, and we already couldn't see anything. Again, some wise scholar of the group spoke. "We'll line up and put a hand on one another's shoulders so we stay together." It wasn't until invisible needles were scratching my face that I realized this plan made no sense. Yes, we'd stick together, but that didn't mean the person in front knew where the hell they were going. I quickly lost track of where we were, and the way back. It felt like we wandered for maybe a half an hour. Then I saw it. At first, in brief glimpses, small flashes. A light peeking through the branches of the trees. Whichever of my friends had the honor of leading us must have seen it too, because it grew brighter and more constant, hurting my eyes. The jewelry box music was so loud here that we would have had to shout to hear one another, if we had any will left to say anything at all. Suddenly, the needles stopped scratching, and the earth under my sneakers turned from soft soil to firm something. I was too tired, cold, and afraid to figure it out at the moment. As a group, we moved forward toward another line of coniferous trees. These ones were taller, and their branches were well maintained, forming intentionally a low ceiling of impenetrable nature, prompting us to crouch and crawl forward to the randomly blinking light in front of us. A fence bumped into my face, an ordinary wooden one, the kind you might see in any neighborhood, with alternating planks of wood. I peeked through one of the gaps, and what I saw made no sense. A woman, all in white, a dress, I think, maybe 30 feet away. I only saw her for a second or two, her face indistinct. She turned toward us and bent down. That's when the jewelry box closed. The music ceased, and the light went out, plunging us all into immediate and total silent dark. I heard breathing. When I realized it was my own, I promptly lost my shit and scrambled away, stopping when I could dimly make out a painted yellow rectangle under my hands. It was lane paint, a road, and a modern one too. I stood up and looked back and forth, realizing, sort of, we'd exited the forest onto the country highway that ran along the front edge of the camp. At least in one direction it did. In the other, it ran towards some city miles away I'd never heard of at the time. I didn't think it over, or look where my friends figured in all this. I picked a direction and bolted. Luckily, I went the right way, and eventually, after how much time, I don't know, turned into the main gate, where Ralph sat in his lawn chair, guarding the camp. I'd never been so glad to see someone. He, on the other hand, didn't look very happy. He said something like, "I don't want to talk right now. I'm going to take you back to your parents and speak to them in the morning." It was then that I saw my friends had also made it back. Without a word, we trudged along, and I was the first one dropped off. My parents had already gone to sleep, and I had a tent outside our trailer, which I crawled into mindlessly, less afraid and more numb by this point. I didn't sleep at first. I remember staring up at my flashlight beam on the ceiling and thinking, what the fuck was that? I thought I'd be up all night, but I did fall asleep, and by morning, my fear had subsided. So, a few weird things had happened, but none of them were really unexplainable. It was the timing of all the events that had weirded me out. The music, the fog, the light, and the lady were strange, but not necessarily supernatural. None of us had died or actually been harmed. Plus, it'd been a pretty cool experience we all shared. I ate breakfast, had a shower, and pieced from my trailer. My parents had no knowledge of my staying out past curfew, which was typical, as they went to bed pretty early and assumed I was in my tent at the proper time. Ralph, it should be noted, never spoke to my parents about catching us walking through the main gate in the middle of the night. We didn't run from him anymore after this, and the few times we spoke to him after, he proved to be a nice guy. I regret being such a dick to Ralph. I rode my bike to the tuck shop, and to the picnic table where my friends were already gathered, our daily meet-up spot. Immediately, I started talking about the night before. So that was pretty effed, eh? Nobody said anything. After a few seconds, one of them asked another about a video game, Mortal Kombat 2, I think. I let it slide, figuring they'd already been in the middle of a conversation when I arrived, and that we'd hash out the details of yesterday in due time. It actually made me feel better they weren't as fixated as I was. Maybe it meant that I was making something out of nothing. Their conversation concluded, and I said my initial statement again. However, no one really acknowledged what I said, and they started talking about other things. I think I tried one more time and got nowhere before the group distracted themselves with riding bikes or going to the pool, or figuring out whose mom was going to drive us into town so we could go to the arcade. Truthfully, I didn't think much of it until the day had been spent, and not one of my friends had brought it up or responded to my prompts. Days passed, and then weeks, and I still couldn't get them to even mention the music, the fog, the road, the trees, the light, and, most importantly, the lady and the darkness that followed her bending or crouching or bowing. It's like she'd known we'd arrived, but how could she? Summer ended. We left the camp and Bridal Veil and returned to our hometowns. I went back to school, resigning myself to being a nobody. I tried to convince myself that nothing significant had happened that night, but I couldn't, still can't, let it go. By the time the next summer rolled around, I was pretty intent on talking about it with at least one of my friends. I confronted him at his trailer as he was leaving. The words poured out of me. Hey, remember last summer with that music, and Ralph was chasing us, and we left the camp, and there was fog, and we got lost, and etc., etc., etc. I may have been out of breath when I finally stopped talking. My friend didn't say anything for what felt like a long time. Then he looked at me, and his eyes narrowed. He shook his head. What are you talking about? He claimed not to know, though he acknowledged our regular games with Ralph. When I approached the others, I got similar responses. As I mentioned earlier, this summer wasn't like the others. We were older, and the group had more or less not returned all at once. Some of the girls from last year had returned, but only briefly, and they were no longer interested in hanging out with me, alone, for long. I resumed my non-identity as a ghost and figured I might as well go home too. At least I had air conditioning and a Super Nintendo there. I thought I would get over that night, and new experiences would unveil the mundane nature and unimportance of it all, but it never did. I still think about it often, and have had nightmares of the lady more than once. I think more about my friend's silence. I haven't seen or heard from them. Do they remember? Did they forget? Were they lying? I never found out.